everyone, and welcome to the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Thank you for joining us virtually here at our museum for Life Stories of the Baltimore Student Protest Movement. I am Margot Pinero, Public Programs Manager at the museum. Today's program will be monitored by MCHC's Director of Education, David Armenti, my colleague. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. And I'm going to leave the rest for you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Margot. And hello to everybody who has joined the webinar so far. We're really excited to have you here today. And I'm personally excited to be a supporter and a part of this conversation. But the main actors and the main folks that we want to focus on, I'll introduce now. We are especially honored to have joining us Judge Robert Mack Bell, who is going to be logging and turning on his video here for us to see, and as well as Dr. Simone Renee Barrett from Morgan State University. But just a little bit about Judge Bell. Robert Mack Bell formerly served as the Chief Judge on the Maryland Court of Appeals before his retirement in 2013. He's a native of Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Judge Bell moved to Baltimore as a youth, then attending city schools, including Paul Laurence Dunbar High School in East Baltimore. He would go on to study history and political science at Morgan State University before completing his JD at Harvard University Law School and being admitted to the Maryland Bar in 1969. He had an illustrious career spanning more than 4 decades, which we will hopefully get a chance to learn a decent amount about today in the time that we have. So thank you so much, Judge Bell, for joining us. And Dr. Barrett will be helping to conduct the conversation and lead the conversation. Simone Renee Barrett is also a native of Baltimore, a historian and museum professional who earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in history, Master of Arts in Museum Studies and Historic Preservation, as well as a doctorate in history from Morgan State University. Her primary area of research is 20th century African American history with a focus on the student-led protest at Morgan State University. And Dr. Barrett currently serves as the research associate for the Robert M. Bell Center for Civil Rights in Education at Morgan. So she's obviously the perfect person to help us dive into the life story of Judge Bell, as well as the overall context around that time period and the participation of students in various activism, at least starting at that time period in the 1950s. So with all of that said, I'd like to introduce our guests and turn it over to Dr. Barrett to get us started with our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, Judge Bell, where would we like to start? Do we want to start with your story, or we want to start with just the overall racial climate of the 1950s and the 1960s? You, as many as other Black youth in the city, only had one school to attend. You know, if you lived in East Baltimore, you went to Dunbar, and if you lived in West Baltimore, you went to Douglas. Is that correct?
Well, that's true, except that, after the 54 decision, Baltimore and the state of Maryland said that the schools were integrated. Turns out that wasn't exactly true. There were certain selected students who were chosen to go to certain selected schools, but for the most part, the schools were segregated. In fact, there were no white students at my school. There was one white teacher, and I found out later that he chose to come there. He asked to come there. He was not assigned there. So things were a little bit different than they were said to be by those in charge. And of course, it's interesting how things were in Baltimore City vis-a-vis the civil rights struggle. As you will remember, Baltimore really was a ghettoized city. you could stay in your side of in your part of the city without going downtown, and so therefore you would not experience the outright racism. You had everything you needed in the community in terms of the movie theaters, the grocery stores, the clothing stores, and that sort of thing. And parents were very careful to keep you there to shield you from some of the overt racism. And that's the way it was. That's the way it was when I was growing up. Huh?
It's odd that you say that, because before the conversation, we had a conversation, and my mother's 10 years older than you. But when I was writing, I asked her, Mom, why didn't you get involved in some of the protests? Because she went to Morgan as well, because she said everything I needed was in my neighborhood.
Well, that's true.
Everything I needed was in my neighborhood.
Well, I say that to point out that things were as they were in the time frame that we're talking about, because the issue had not boiled up to the point where people were really engaged in trying to make changes. Those changes were being made at institutions like Morgan, right, where students were not in that same cocoon. They were in a different cocoon. They were in a different place where, in order to go to the restaurant, they were in a place that didn't accept them. They didn't have their own restaurants to go to. Northwood, for example, was a foreign, like a foreign country to the students there, because they didn't accept them. And so there was a need to make changes there if you were going to survive and live in that environment in a comfortable way.
So how did you become involved? The students, Morgan students, came to the high schools and enlisted high school students to join the protest? That's
an interesting thing. That's exactly what happened. My story is really the story of Morgan.
Okay.
Because, as I said, I was not particularly engaged in any effort to change anything. I was, however, the student council president at Dunbar. And when, as I learned later, Morgan began its annual effort to change things, to desegregate and to integrate, they decided this particular time, apparently, to use high school students in the protest. And I was contacted by a student from Morgan who asked that I help recruit high school students to participate in the planned protest, which was for the final day of school in 1960. I don't remember whether he limited the students to be asked to juniors and seniors, but I suspect that he did, because age 16 was a critical age. If you were 16 years old in Baltimore City, you were an adult. If you were 18 in other parts of the state, you were an adult. So there was a distinction. I don't know how that played into it, but Dunbar students, and I don't know whether other students from across the state were asked or not, but from across the city were asked or not, but we were asked to become involved in the protest that was scheduled for that Friday after school. And my job was to enlist folk to try to get them to go on the protest. Now, in order to get me to agree, of course, they had to make the case that it was a worthwhile venture. And they did indeed make the case, and I agreed. And of course, on the final day of school, we were able to fill a bus that went downtown for the protest.
Okay, so you just went downtown to what? Right, you remember the restaurant? Was the Hoopers?
Well, there were two phases to it. The first phase was picketing restaurants on Baltimore Street, and toward about an hour or so into that, the leader of our group decided that we would go off to see if we could find a restaurant in which to sit in. And that's what we did. And the leader of our group was John Quarles.
Yes, I've heard that name. Okay.
He and his wife were the leaders of that group. And so we went up the street to Hooper's restaurant. And interestingly enough, Hooper's restaurant was open. All of the other restaurants in the area were closed, but they were open. And we went in, and of course, we sat down. And the game plan was to take up as much space as possible. So we sat it, each one of us sat at a different table and whatnot. And when asked to leave, we refused to do so. And of course, the police were, well, first of all, Mr. Hooper came in and pleaded with us to leave. And eventually the police were called, and they read the trespass statute to us. When we refused to leave, we were told that we were going to be placed under arrest. Show you the ingenuity of our leaders. John Quarles came up with the plan that, well, these are young people. Why don't we just agree that they'll come down on Monday and be processed, and that'll constitute the arrest. And that's what happened. He made a deal with the police to let us go home and then appear at the Central District Police Station on Falls Way and be processed on that Monday. And we did.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned something in that passage about the Trespass Act or law.
Mm-hmm.
Please explain to the people exactly what that was. When
Well, it's a criminal statute.
Right.
It's a criminal statute which prohibits someone from being on another person's property without their permission. And if they are advised to leave and refuse to do so, they can be charged criminally and serve time in jail and pay a fine.
But didn't the police actually have to read that
Of course.
act before they could arrest somebody?
He had to read the act, and once that was done, you were given the option of leaving. If you did not leave, then of course you were arrested.
Okay. Now, how did that arrest affect you personally? Did you go back again after that one arrest? Did you continue to pursue a civil rights activism? And definitely, how did that affect your law career going forward?
Well, you know, the arrest wasn't the thing that concerned me so much. It was what happened at the picketing stage of our effort that was a problem for me. I never knew, was not prepared for the kind of venom and hatred that was out there, and that would be spewed at young people who were just trying to make some progress in terms of equality. There were people there yelling and screaming and really threatening. And of course, the problem would have been, had there been physical contact, had there been some violence, what does one do? Now, I know that the movement said you cannot hit back, which is totally foreign to the way I was raised. And so it was at that point that I realized that I could do it as long as people stayed away from me and did not hit me. But if somebody were to hit me, I was not sure that I could have restrained myself. So I did not engage in any other kind of protest for that reason, and for that reason alone. It wasn't the arrest. After all, I had been arrested. That didn't bother me. Nor did I understand at the time the potential impact that an arrest would have on my future career. I didn't think about that until I applied to Harvard Law School. And they sent me an application in which I had to report any arrests, not convictions, but any arrests I'd had. And I realized at that point that having been arrested could have had an impact upon my law school career. It turns out, of course, and if one really thought about it logically, one would have seen that that kind of activism would not be a demerit. It would be a merit for you. So it turns out it would not have influenced in an adverse way my career at all. But I didn't know that at the time. But other than that, it had no impact except that, having to go through a trial.
Right.
And remember, I said that at age 16 you are treated as an adult. You're not a juvenile. Any place in the state except in Baltimore City would have been juvenile, which meant that you couldn't have gone to jail. You couldn't have gotten any strong punishment, as it were. But in Baltimore City, we could have had adult punishment imposed upon us. And so there was that kind of stress that was involved. But beyond that, I suspect it had no impact other than it made me somewhat of a celebrity when I went to Morgan.
Right. So, okay. So when you did come to Morgan and you saw the activism still going on, you had the CIG, which was affiliated.
Civic Interest Group. Mm-hmm.
Right. You had CORE, with Walter P. Carter. How did those affect you when you did come back to finish your AB degree in history? Or did you just come back and just focus basically on your studies and not get involved with the activism going forward?
I did not go on the Northwood protest, no. Okay. But I was very active on campus. And as I said, I became student government president at Morgan.
Okay.
And I was engaged in many of the movements that were extant at the time, and did not shy away from them at all. And in fact, that experience, the activism that Morgan students caused me to experience in the first instance, and in a sense instilled in me, has been something that I have used as I've gone forward in my career. It's been something that I have tried to exercise and to utilize and to do as I went forward.
Okay. Now, how do you see the activism of your generation and even the generation before you, like doing Reverend Sands, Douglas Sands' generation in the 50s? How do you see that generation affected what happened in the 90s with Travis Mitchell, who's now a bigwig over MPT, and Chinedu, and the court case that the HBCUs just won? How do you see what you and people before you, how does that activism play into what you see today going on?
It's all really a continuum. When people do things today, it's really building a bridge for those who come later. And hopefully that bridge will be a sufficient basis for them to make progress, but also will be an inspiration for them to build another bridge to ensure that the later generation proceeds. And I think that's what has been the core of what Morgan students have done. They've started off by trying to improve their own situation. In doing so, they've improved the situation for those coming after them. But having set the example, those coming after have done the same thing, and they have contributed forward to the betterment of the situation for those who come after them. So I see these things as being totally interrelated and inspirational in the sense that it inspires those at present to think about what's happening in the future with an eye, of course, to the past, so that you can understand the impact of what you do, of what has been done or not done in the past, what that impact has on the present, and how you can improve things for the future.
I hate to go down this road. But I guess I must say this. What was the worst thing you ever saw? And with some of the things that the Supreme Court has just overturned, do you see them overturning, upstaging any of the discrimination um, or the desegregation? I'm glad the 13th, 14th, and 15th are amendments, so they can't be necessarily overturned. But do you see any the Black community or minority communities that have fought so long to get ahead or just break even in this country? Do you
Well,
see anything just going backwards?
well, what the Supreme Court has really done, and I guess to some of us who've been following the progress of the civil rights movement, quote unquote, over the years, what they've done is to give us a wake-up call to say that progress made is not necessarily eternal, that there's always a need to be vigilant to make sure that what you have achieved through your activism is continually in progress and moving forward. And you can't rest on your laurels, in other words. It is something that you've got to be concerned about because once you get to a situation where the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what is right, what is wrong, what the law is, and then you know that you must make sure that you keep before you the goal of ensuring that the situation that is presented in the legal case that's presented to the Supreme Court is such that they will not have the opportunity or the ability to turn it back. Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Barrett, if you don't mind me
Sure.
chiming in, we do have some comments and questions coming in through the Q&A, and I also wanted to kind of get a little bit more information about something you mentioned earlier. So we did have one question, Judge Bell, and I don't know if you or even Dr. Barrett, you might know. You mentioned John Quarles and his wife. Is that a relation, a son or other of Benjamin Quarles, who also is, a Morgan State icon?
As far as I know, no.
Okay.
He was a
I didn't
student.
think so either. Yeah.
He's a student. He was a student, and his wife was a student at Morgan. I'm not sure. I took courses from Dr. Quarles later, and no, I'm pretty sure they were not related.
Okay. And my question was kind of getting back to the court case that you were directly involved in starting in high school. That went on for multiple years, right? I think one of the interesting things is, and people might assume, a case happens and then it's done, but we're talking about multiple years here, multiple court levels. Could you maybe talk about the mechanics of how that developed?
Sure.
And were you kind of traveling to all of these different courts? Did it kind of impact your later high school and early college years in that way?
Well, the court case started, of course, in Baltimore City Circuit Court, criminal court, and it resulted in a conviction for each of us and a fine of $10 and costs, which was suspended. That then was appealed to the Court of Appeals of Maryland, which is the highest court in Maryland, was then and is still the highest court in Maryland. The difference is that in those days, there was no intermediate appellate court, so it went directly to the Supreme Court of Maryland, which affirmed the conviction. That then went to the Supreme Court of the United States, which reversed it. It didn't reverse it. It sent the case back. It vacated the judgment and sent the case back to Baltimore, to the Maryland Court of Appeals, to review the case in light of changed circumstances. You see, in between the time of our conviction and the affirmance of the conviction by the Court of Appeals, the Maryland legislature passed public accommodations legislation, and the city council passed the public accommodations ordinance, so that if we had been charged after those ordinances had been passed, we would not have been, we would never have been tried. We never would have been charged, because that would have been no longer a crime. The Court of Appeals, having to review the case again, decided initially that they were right the first time, and so they therefore affirmed the conviction. But later, on motion for reconsideration, they reversed and acquitted us of the charges, finding that the intervening events had prevented there being a basis for conviction.
And tell us that our irony of that case, that you replaced the chief judge that had voted against you. When you got to chief judge, you replaced him.
Well, there were a lot of interesting little twists in there. In fact, I served on the circuit court,
right,
with the judge who prosecuted the case, and I served on this court of appeals with the judge who represented the state in the first appeal to the court of appeals, and I served on the court of appeals with the chief judge of the court of appeals, who was the judge who represented the court of appeals, the state of Maryland, on remand from the Supreme Court. And it was that judge that I replaced when I became chief judge of the court of appeals. So there were little twists and turns in there. Fate is a funny thing.
Yes, I would say so. Have any more questions, David? Have any more questions?
Definitely. I want to kind of dig into some of those details that were mentioned earlier, and we can keep it going. You mentioned 1954, Judge Bell, and I know this might have been something that Dr. Barrett, your mother, might have observed as well, and maybe it wasn't as impactful in the community of East Baltimore, where there was that kind of self-contained community. But what were some of the changes that you might have seen as a young person in Baltimore, whether it was within the schools or otherwise? You mentioned that there were no white students at Dunbar High School, maybe only one white teacher. But did you see that decision kind of impacting other students around you? Like, did students transfer out to go to formerly all white schools? Kind of what was the scene when that occurred?
There were students from Dunbar who ended up transferring into other schools. City College was one, and then you had certain girls going to Eastern High School or Western. But there were very few of them. Some went to Polytechnic, of course, but that was not something that we saw on a regular basis. Things were pretty much ordinary insofar as the day-to-day activities at school were concerned. Dunbar did not change. But Douglas did not change. The only schools that changed were predominantly white schools, and they only changed in a very small way. In all honesty, I did not see much of an impact. And so when people said that the schools were integrated, it was hard to see how you could call what was being done integration. In fact, we often laughed about it and suggested that it was being touted as integration without any substance being given to it.
I started kindergarten in 1960, but my mom was a high school teacher and my dad was a firefighter. They both worked my mom worked at Patterson, which was all white. Completely white. She was the second African-American teacher in the school. They told her at the end of her first year to bring her books to the book or to, I don't know, some room. And when she went in, she noticed that they were erasing the number of Patterson, which was 405, and stamping the number of Dunbar. So what that told her, the books that were no longer good enough for the white students to use were going to be sent to her alma mater, Dunbar. She immediately put took us out of Baltimore City schools. We didn't go back to Baltimore City schools until I was in junior high. We went to Catholic school throughout. She said she was not going to subject her children to that kind of segregation where they could not get the most updated books. And she saw it for herself. I mean, this is things, when I was in Catholic school, we used to take a trip to Gwynn Oak Park every year. When I first started this job with Morgan, a gentleman came, Pete O'Neill from Channel 2 News, and did a whole documentary that Gwynn Oak Park wasn't even integrated until 63. And that was part of the integration, is that the Catholic schools, whoever was in the archdiocese said, if you integrate the schools, we'll make sure that all our Catholic schools do a school trip to your park to drum up business. Really? This is in the 60s and we're going through this? I mean, this isn't Alabama or Atlanta. This is Baltimore. And I understand that on the Eastern Shore and other places, it was even worse than that. Not Baltimore, but Maryland was the only place, and it was Cambridge, Maryland, was the only place where National Guard ever stayed for a year. And they stayed down there and put a gun in a woman's face. That woman was Gloria Richardson. So I'm just saying, Maryland has some ugliness when it comes to their civil rights and their integration history. Definitely.
Right.
For sure. And we've got some more questions coming through in the chat, and I'll mix in my own questions because I'm never going to run out.
Okay.
But Judge Bell and again Dr. Barrett, please chime in as well. Janet Johnson wonders, she heard that Goucher students were also involved in protests supporting Morgan students.
That's true.
Whether that was at Northwood or perhaps Reed's Drugstore or some of the others around town. Were you aware of Goucher students participating, or white students from other universities becoming involved?
Oh yes, yeah. That was well known. There were certain, clearly they were involved. They were involved in not only protesting, but they were also involved in tutoring and those kinds of things as well. So there was an involvement between certain college students, white college students, and Black students.
In my dissertation, I have a picture that I obtained from the Afros archives that clearly show Black and white students from Goucher. And the thing that shocked me the most, back then we had something called a dean of students and a dean of women. And the dean of women was a lady by the name of Dr. Thelma Bando. And if anybody knows Dr. Thelma Bando, she was no nonsense. She took linen napkins, tablecloths down to the jail. She took people their medication. She took books. She told them, just because you're in jail, that doesn't mean you don't set a proper table and you don't still keep up with your studies. So she wasn't for it. And, I remember somebody asked during the defense, well, did they let her in? Did they let her in? She was getting in one way. Either they were going to let her in the right way, or she was going to create such a hassle where they were going to arrest and let her in. But she was getting into jail to make sure, to do her job and to make sure that her women, her young ladies were taken care of. And that's what she did. Would you agree, Judge Bell? Do you remember?
Yeah. And it was also Hopkins students are also involved. I should point that out.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we did have a contingency of white students that definitely came and helped in with the Morgan. Coppin students came. So it wasn't just Morgan students, it was students from other HBCUs. When we went down on the Eastern Shore, it wasn't called University of Maryland Eastern Shore, it was called Maryland State. Those students became involved.
And you, I always found it interesting too when we talk about student activism, and especially during this time period. While if you're over 16 or over 18, maybe you're legally considered an adult. A lot of these folks were still thinking about, well, what are my parents going to think? This wasn't
Hmm.
necessarily going to be accepted even by people within the community, to put yourself in danger legally or bodily danger that you talked about. There are many oral histories that I think we've probably all absorbed, where former students talked about, well, I didn't tell my mother until afterwards, and I still had to worry about my studies. That was what was going to be most important. It wasn't going to be an excuse that I was involved
Hmm.
in this work. So I don't know if Judge Bell, maybe you had some commentary about how did your family members feel, or did you hear about other students kind of having those reservations about getting involved because of what it might mean on a personal level?
Well, I can tell you about what happened with me. My my mother was a stickler for education, and she always said that if you got an education, that can't be taken away. So I knew that if I were to ask her about participating in a demonstration where it was possible to be arrested, I knew she would have said no. So some of these other people did, I never told my mother that I was going to participate. I just did it. And once I'd done it, she was extremely supportive because she understood the importance of standing up for one's rights and making a difference in the society. So, but there were other students who went on the demonstration who had that conversation with their parents beforehand. I was speaking to one just the other day, and she said that her mother told her she could go so long as she didn't get arrested. And so she was one of the people who left when the police officer read the uh, trespass statute. So there were clearly concerns on the parts of people who thought about the impact on their futures as to how they ought to proceed. And at Morgan, when they were doing the Northwood protests, clearly those students were concerned about their grades and what the impact would be. Many of them fretted about it, but they weighed the situation and determined that it was much more important that they make that statement, that they participate, that they protest, than because if they didn't do that, then the grades, the education they got would not be as good as it would be would not be as worthwhile valuable as it would be otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to understand, what a potential sacrifice it was, and what those
Hmm.
risks were, and that there were, at times hundreds of students involved, particularly in the Northwood protests,
Hmm.
who were facing those challenges.
That's true. Yeah.
Another question that we have from Marcia: as a young man, were you aware of other protests going on in surrounding states at the time? Or, and I would add too, since Dr. Barrett alluded to it, in other parts of the state, like Cambridge and Dorchester County on the Eastern Shore, were you aware of kind of that regional context, national context, or was it more just, what you saw in your immediate community that concerned you?
Oh no, no. Once it was over, you know, the civil rights movement, according to a lot of historians, began when the Greensboro, North Carolina.
Mhm.
We all knew about that, but we also knew here that it was not the beginning of it. We were aware of the protests gaining steam across the country. And we knew about what was going on the Eastern Shore, primarily here in Maryland. Uh, but in the early days, as I said, there were not many of us who were aware of very much. We weren't concerned about it. But as time passed, uh, the the protest movement gained steam, and we became much more aware of what was going on, and we used those protest efforts in other parts of the state and in other parts of the country as an example for why we ought to continue doing what we were doing here.
And Dr. Barrett, we actually, I think we've all alluded to it at this point, but we had a question coming through. Could you offer specifics about the Northwood protests and also maybe some comment about Morgan participation in the Reed's drugstore protests?
Okay. Reed's drugstore, people don't realize, was prior to, years prior, 5 years prior to the Greensboro protest. And the kids just went up one day and protested in Northwood, and they got served. Right? They were the first, not the first. There were some others. It was one over in DC in like 48. There was one downtown at a Kresge's or something in 52 or 53. But after 55, I don't know, the drugstore, not just one, all 37. So that was major. That was huge. 37 drugstores opened up to Black people come in and eat. Because who was cooking the food most of the time? It was Black women. It wasn't white women working those kitchens. A lot of times it was Black women. So just the protests, and I think they had a conversation. I'm not going to say they got sick of it. I think they sat down and they had a conversation with the civic interest group, and we're neighbors. We're not going nowhere. You're not going nowhere. Morgan is still here. The Rite Aid, Reed's, or whatever it is, it's been long gone. So in the end, we outlasted them. And I just think somebody died. I think the segregationist died, and his son saw things in a more open light. And his son was willing to try it out. And it worked out well. He had no problems. People, I don't want to say people knew how to act then, but people would come in, sit down, eat, order food, eat, and I don't want to say act more civilized, but things weren't as rambunctious as they are today when young people may be coming to your restaurant. So they came in, they had, the president looking at them, the dean of women and men. Okay, they've let you into these places, so go and act accordingly. Women couldn't wear pants to school back then. You had to wear dresses. The only time they could wear pants is when they went to the football games or on the weekends. So it was a whole different culture. And I think the younger generation just saw that it was time for a change. And I think he might have also looked at the amount of revenue he's missing out. There's a whole new market of valuable customers that have real money to spend. Their money is green just like everybody else's. Would you agree, Judge Bell?
What?
That, a lot of these businesses finally saw maybe the amounts of finances they may have been losing out on by denying, Black customers, especially if you're like the only one in the Black area. If you have a whole school of students and you have a lunch counter and you're the only one, why wouldn't you open it to Black students?
Well, certainly economics played a role in it, but of course the other things played a role as well. The pressure that was brought to bear by the protests themselves and the publicity that surrounded the brutality of some of the responses, all of that played a role. And of course, as when the Civil Rights Bill passed, of course, that also entered into the picture and had some impact on it as well. Yeah.
And Dr. Barrett, you mentioned that, Morgan is still there. Northwood Shopping Center being that location basically just across the street from the campus, which has now been bought and absorbed by the campus, if I'm
Exactly.
remembering that correctly. So it's, I don't know if that's an irony or if it's just appropriate that the school ultimately, became more integrated in the neighborhood overall, and even kind of took over some of the sites that had been contentious there back in the 50s and 60s.
Well, as early as the 1920, people were horribly outrageous at John Goucher for even building the campus over here. How dare he? They were building new homes. They had garages, and you could see the garages from Hillen Road. They put up a wall so they didn't have to see, because the entrance to the school, as I understand it, was on the corner of Cold Spring and Helen. They put up a hate wall, spike wall. That's with Dr. Dwight, what's his name? Dwight. Was the other president before Jenkins? Dwight. One of the presidents at the time put up a wall and he called it the spite wall, because the white neighbors did not want to see. They couldn't walk down the front of the yards. One lady called me from Florida. I was featured in USA Today, and she lived on Cold Spring during that time. And she reached out to me and we talked, and I even, put a small feature about her in my dissertation. And she talked about that the Black children had to walk down the alley. She had a friend. She invited the friend over. She was a Black child. She didn't know. And the friend just told her no. And she said, well, ask your mother. I think it'll be okay. And the child just kept telling her no. And she just couldn't understand. And she said her mother just hated when the students walked in front of the house, like they had done something wrong. So I just don't understand how I couldn't imagine when my child was 6 or 7 being so hateful at something, that when he sees these people walk down the street, I have to make a disparaging remark about them. And it's Dr. Holmes. It was Dr. Holmes, Dwight Holmes. Yeah, that said they built the spite wall. Yeah, so there's always been somewhat of a contention between the white people, because this was an all-white neighborhood. In 1920, I don't even think there was a lot of buildings other than the campus here.
So this one directly to you, Judge Bell, from another attendee here. Did Robert Murphy ever apologize for his role in your conviction? Do you have any recollection about meeting Thurgood Marshall before your trial, who you have over your right shoulder there?
No, the answer to the first question is no. Bob Murphy never did apologize, because, and nor did I expect him to. He was a lawyer doing what he was supposed to do in defense of his client. And he made the best argument he could, and he was able to convince the court. And of course, once the court reversed itself, he did not rant and rave about it. He understood that what the process was. So, and by the way, he and I became good friends over the course of the years. And what was the other question? The other question was,
did you have a recollection of meeting or interacting with Thurgood Marshall?
Never met him until after the case. In fact, I never had a chance to even talk to him about the case, to tell you the truth. The interesting thing is that I did get to talk to Justice Brennan, about it. Justice Brennan was the judge who wrote the opinion sending the case back to the state of Maryland for review. And he lamented the fact that the court never did reach the merits of the case, and they did not. The case was really presented to the court for the purpose of determining whether or not you could use a criminal statute, which was clear on its face and unambiguous on its face, to enhance and to prolong legal segregation. And he said, we never got to that point, and he lamented the fact that they never could get to that point. But I met Thurgood several years later, but never did get a chance to talk to him about the case.
And you certainly carried on that legacy that Thurgood and others started here. Folks coming out of Baltimore and responding to these challenges and really having an impact on a national level. We have one. I'm going to have this as our one last question before we start to wrap up here. Beverly wants to know, Judge Bell, who were the attorneys who represented you before the Supreme Court?
Beverly Carter, I know that's who that is. She happens to be my former law clerk. Constance Baker Motley, Jack Greenberg, Tucker Deering. Tucker Deering, who was a graduate of Howard Law School, represented us on appeal. Earlier, Juanita Jackson Mitchell was involved as well as Robert Bernard Watts.
Oh my God!
Those were the ones who represented us on appeal. It turns out, and this is something that I just found out because I looked at the case recently, and I found that Derek Bell was on the brief. He was a young lawyer at the NAACP Inc. Fund at the time, and he was involved in Bell against Maryland as well. The funny thing about that is that I recruited him to be a professor at the Harvard Law School.
Wow!
As I said, fate is a funny thing.
I didn't know you had those judges. I had no idea you had those judges.
Mm-hmm. Well, there were a lot of people involved, but the main ones were, of course, Constance Baker Motley and Jack Greenberg. Those were the main ones.
Yeah.
I'm recognizing several of those names in addition to yours that are represented in the oral history collection here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture.
Oh yeah.
Including Tucker Deering and Judge Robert Watts. So I know for myself and for our listeners out there, there's certainly a lot more research to be done. We could only learn so much from both of you in 1 hour, but this has been really great. I appreciate both of you and your time. So again, part of the reason why we wanted to have this conversation was to, illuminate the personal stories that are still so valuable within the movement, and recognize what, folks are still doing today and how that legacy continues. But in addition to the oral histories that we have here in our library collection, we also have an incredible new exhibition that just opened last month called Passion and Purpose, Voices of Maryland Civil Rights Activists. And Judge Bell's story, amongst so many others within that exhibition, is represented there, along with those snippets, as well as access to some of the full audio and transcript of oral histories. So again, I certainly welcome our audience to circle back with us, come visit us in person, do some research as well. But this has really given us a lot to chew on and think about. Any kind of parting words, Dr. Barrett or Judge Bell, for the listeners out there about, maybe what we should have learned or have learned from this period, or what we still need to do in this area?
Well, for me, every time I sit down and speak to gracious gentleman. I always learn something new. I didn't know that all of these great lawyers worked on this case. So every time I talk to him, it's a learning experience.
Well,
Always.
where we are right now is an indication of what we must do. That the time for activism has not passed. In fact, it exists more so today than ever before. And the reason for that, of course, is because it is much more difficult to go back and repeat a victory than it is to try to sustain that victory before it has been taken away. And so we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Activism needs to be redoubled, quite frankly. And I think we have to look to the young people to once again do it.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
Those are good words to end our program with, don't you think, David?
I think so.
We want to thank all of you out there for joining us today. We invite all of you to come and see, as David said, to see for yourself our exhibition, Passion and Purpose. And we look forward to our next virtual program, which I put in the chat for you on July 23rd. It's A Ride to Remember, where the authors Amy Nathan and Sharon Langley will join us for a reading of their picture book, and we'll do some art making as well. So check the link for that chat